You are listening to In the Crease, the show that slices deep in the history's strangest footnotes, where blood sometimes seeps through the old stone and echoes never quite die. I am your host, Jeff, and tonight we're going to march onto cursed ground. This is episode 65, The Phantom Battle of Edge Hill. And we're going to get in our little time machine and go back to October 23rd, 1642. Now, for those that may not be into history, this is when the English Civil War was just beginning. Brother is fighting brother, king faces parliament. God's will is invoked from both sides by cannon, by sword, and by fire. And in the quiet hills near a village called Edgehill in Warwickshire, thousands will clash, hundreds will die, and the dead, some say, did not stay buried. Because what happened at Edge Hill didn't apparently end when the sun went down. Not that night, not for weeks, and not even for centuries. Soldiers have seen them, priests have heard them, and kings have been warned of their return. This is the story of a battle that never stopped, a haunting that's been officially recorded by the British Crown, a battlefield that keeps waking up again and again and again. Tonight, we will walk the fog drenched moor of Edgehill and ask the questions no history book really wants to touch. Did something supernatural happen here? Or was it even something far worse? War, memory, trauma given shape and voice. This is In the Crease, episode 65, The Phantom Battle of Edgehill. Now let's go to war. So in October of 1642, England is not just divided, it's cracking apart like a frostbitten pane of glass. On one side, King Charles I, a monarch who believes his power flows straight from God's own hand, divine right, unquestioned authority, and absolute rule. A king whose belief in hierarchy is as firm as the stone in his throne room. On the other, Parliament, furious, emboldened, and increasingly armed, tired of taxes, of royal whims, of papist sympathies, and iron fisted decrees. They see tyranny. More importantly, they smell blood and they want control. And the result is war, a civil war. Never understood the civil part of war. It's not like it's very civil most of the time. But this is the first in a series that will convulse England, Scotland, and even Ireland for nearly 2 decades. And like so many civil wars, it begins not with ideology, but honestly, geography. Charles has fled London. The capital, along with the Puritan majority, is solidly parliamentarian. So the king sets up court in Oxford and begins raising a royalist army in the north and the west. In return, Parliament raises its own army in London and in the southeast under the command of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Two armies, one kingdom, and let's face it, neither side is ready to blink. And by mid October 1642, these forces are marching blindly toward each other through the middle of England. And there, halfway between Oxford and London, lies a quiet stretch of moorland between the villages of Kyneton and Edge Hill. The ground, a little sloped, the trees a little thin, and the fog often clings low and cold to the hedgerows. The land, this unassuming patch of Warwickshire, is about to become soaked in history, and probably not just history if you catch my meaning. Now, King Charles may be God's appointed monarch, but as a general, he's no Alexander. His army is divided among noblemen with massive egos and conflicting agendas. At his side is Prince Rupert of the Rhine, just 23 years old, but already a seasoned commander with a fearsome cavalry reputation. Rupert will become a legend in this war, both as a military genius and as a hothead. His royalist army is about 13,500 strong, roughly equal in number to the parliamentarian force under Essex, which is slower, more methodical, and frankly, not the most inspiring presence on the field. Most of these men have never fought in a real battle. They're more or less farmers, apprentices, dock workers. Their uniforms are a patchwork joke. Their muskets misfire as often as they shoot. Their pikes are recycled from Tudor armors. And a militia war, scrappy, desperate, and, soaked in fear is what their plan is. You would think, oh, I don't know, 100 years later, the English would have learned from this battle. But hey, what can we say? The British conquered half the world for spices and forget to use it on their food. So they're not the brightest bulb in the bunch. But by the evening of October 22nd, the two armies find themselves facing each other against across a rolling plain near the village of England. Rupert's royalists take the high ground, occupying the ridge. The parliamentarians are still slightly scattered, disorganized, and apparently caught off guard. But there is hesitation. The sun is sinking fast, and Charles, ever cautious, ever pious, and very stubborn, refuses to order an attack on the Sabbath. So instead of launching the war's first major battle, both sides camp in the mist, barely a cannon's throw apart, waiting and watching, and listening to the wind whistle over ground that will by dawn become unrecognizable. That night, locals huddled in their cottages, horses spooked in their stables, and campfires were flickering dimly across the damp. And something odd is said to happen. Some soldiers claim they heard voices, echoes, as if men were speaking behind them, but no one was there. Others say the air is colder than it should be, like winter is pressing through a crack in autumn. And a few report dreams that they just couldn't simply shake. Dreams of fire, of men with no eyes, of battlefield smoke that tastes way too similar to blood. Superstition, sure. But remember, this is an England still tangled in old beliefs. The Civil War may be political on paper, but on the ground, it feels more apocalyptic. Every omen seems to matter. Every shadow could be divine judgment or devilish trickery. As midnight passes, the fog thickens, and at first light, the thunder begins. At or approximately 2 p.m. on October 23rd, the Royalists begin to descend from the ridge. Prince Rupert leaves the cavalry on the right flank, his personal specialty. They're mounted, they're fast, and very vicious, charging parliamentarian troops with sabers drawn and cries of "For the King." Now, the parliamentarian left wing collapses almost instantly. Some do try to fight, others just simply run. It's chaos, hooves, blood, confusion. Rupert's cavalry chases the fleeing soldiers for nearly 2 miles, but it was a tactical blunder in retrospect. It actually removed them from the main field and gives Parliament Center a chance to regroup. Meanwhile, the foot soldiers clash in the center like iron jaws closing. Pikes stab, muskets would roar, but the smoke ended up so thick that visibility drops to mere feet. It's less a coordinated battle and kind of more of an Irish bar brawl happening in a thundercloud. Commanders scream orders, but seems like no one can hear them. Regiments vanish into the mist only to reappear in pieces. A unit of royalists, mistaking another royalist regiment for the enemy, opens fire, killing dozens of their own. There is no strategy, it's just simply slaughter. On the royalist left, Lord Wilmot's cavalry charges Essex right, but the parliamentarian infantry holds firm. Here, musketeers and pikemen form dense lines and repel the horsemen with very grim resolve. By nightfall, it was clear no victor was going to emerge. Both sides were holding the field, and both sides were bleeding. Some say up to 1,000 died that day. Others put it a little bit higher, some others a little bit lower. But what is agreed upon is this: the field of Edgehill drank deep, and something Something remained behind. Now, within days, strange reports start to emerge. Villagers claim to hear the sounds of battle at night, but no soldiers were there. Cannons booming in the distance, the ring of steel on steel, horses were even screaming. A local shepherd, alarmed by the noise, climbed the ridge to investigate, only returned white as linen, claiming to have seen men fighting in the sky. Not metaphorically, literally in the sky. Spectral soldiers clashing above the ridge in ghostly silence. This news would spread quickly. And, well, it didn't take long for word to reach the king himself. Now, in a move so unusual, it's actually worth emphasizing here. Charles I ordered an official inquiry into the Edgehill phenomenon. Yes, yes, you're hearing me right. The English crown sent investigators to look into a haunting. Reverend Thomas Broomhall is dispatched to examine the reports. He speaks to locals, soldiers, and the clergy. The findings? Well, his findings were inconclusive. Now, I know what you're saying. Inconclusive. That's not a dismissal. In fact, some court records suggest the apparitions were seen repeatedly over the course of several weeks, always at dusk, always in the same place, and always with the sound of battle ringing out across the empty fields. One chronicler writes that the king's men saw, quote, phantasms of soldiers in arms flying and striking, retreating and charging again and again, with the thunder of drumming and the moaning of the wounded, unquote. The official line, God's warning to the kingdom. But the people of Edgehill knew better. They've seen the fog, they heard the cries, they felt the ground rumble. The war may have moved on to a different battlefield, but this field remembered. Now, it should be noted, the morning after the Battle of Edgehill was still eerily still. What had once been a rolling pastoral moor had transformed into a smoking charnel ground. Corpses lie in rows. Horses were stiff in the frost, muffled weeping from the few who survived long enough to realize what had just happened. There were no cries of victory, no cheers of triumph. For the most part, only silence and smoke. By some accounts, a damp fog settled that morning thicker than any before it. Strange for a late October, even in Warwickshire. Some men reported not being able to see the tips of their own pikes. Others claim they heard the dead still moving just out of view. But that's the fog of war, isn't it? War plays tricks on the mind, especially civil war, where, truth be known, you may have known the man you just struck down. You may have once shared your house with, your ale, maybe even your Bible with. As bodies were gathered from the field by conscripted locals, pressed villagers, and scavengers, stories began to form like condensation to a blade. The royalist dead were said to be buried hastily in mass graves dug too shallow. Some, not at all. Others simply looted and left to the crows. The parliamentarian corpses, those not reclaimed by fleeing comrades, were heaped into mounds and covered with sod. In one account, later repeated by clergymen and travelers alike, a group of parliamentarian bodies were stacked like timber near a bit of trees, only to be gone by the morning. Their prints remained, blood soaked the grass, but the bodies, the corpses, nowhere. Locals whispered that the men had refused to be buried. They'd been distributed by the way they were treated, or perhaps by the fact that they'd never finished what they'd come to do. This became the root of the Edgehill curse, they'd say. Unfinished battle. Now, the first official sighting came less than a week after the battle. A man named John Davies, a carpenter from Kennington, reported to his parish vicar that he had seen armored men floating above the ground, clashing blades without noise. They vanished when he approached, leaving behind only the crushed grass where their boots should have stood. The vicar, of course, dismissed it. Until the next morning, when two boys herding sheep near the ridge ran screaming into the village, claiming to have seen, quote, ghost soldiers, unquote. Not one, not a lone figure on the edge of dawn, but entire units marching, drilling, dying again, and returning to formation once more. The description they gave matched the armor worn by royalist cavalry, pauldrons, buff coats, curved sabers. They they said, had come alive again. Now, as word spread, people began avoiding the Edgehill Ridge until after sunset. Even soldiers on furlough or on patrol gave it a wider berth than they normally would. But not everyone stayed away. Some came to see, some came to listen, and of course, some came to profit. Taverns in the nearby village of Radway offered drinks to travelers daring enough to sleep, quote, within reach of the haunted moor, unquote. A few even sold phantom tokens, scraps of rusted iron supposedly found at the site, bearing ghostly cold to the touch. More likely, it was pulled from, an abandoned royalist supply coach or maybe even refashioned old garden tools. But hey, profit's a profit, right? But there were witnesses who weren't selling anything. Like the schoolmaster from Warwick who claimed in a letter to his brother that his horse had, quote, refused to cross the northern track at Edgehill, eyes wide, teeth chattering, though there was no visible threat, unquote. Or how about the local herbalist, Margaret Way, who reported hearing, quote, sickly drumming, unquote, that no one else could hear at regular intervals near twilight. Now, her health declined within months. She stopped sleeping, claimed she'd begun to hear her own name called from the tree line. She died in 1643 fever, they said. But her apprentice would tell a different story. She died saying over and over, they never left. They never left. They never left. Now, these weren't isolated superstitions. Like, they did reach court. And King Charles I, himself shaken by a spiritual weight of civil war, ordered the official inquiry. Now, once again, the result was Reverend Thomas Broomhill and a small retinue of witnesses, not soldiers, not clergy, but scribes, heralds, and couriers. People with royal connections and reputations at stake. They came to Edgehill in December 1642. And apparently, what they saw took at least some of them. According to Edward Wooton, who compiled the events in a letter to Lord Digby, preserved in several royal papers, by the way, the group stayed 2 nights in the manor house overlooking the ridge. Both nights, they saw lights, orbs of pale blue flame floating over the battlefield. They heard musket volleys, timed at precise intervals, but there were no flashes, no soldiers, and no bodies. And perhaps most disturbingly, they saw what appeared to be entire lines of troops, shadowy and indistinct, marching from one end of the ridge to the other, vanishing near that tree line. It looked less like a mass haunting and more like a reenactment. The battle itself just kept seeming to play again and again and again, line for line. Now, on January 5th of 1643, a report was submitted to the Royal Council. It's titled, quote, the true relation of the apparition at Edgehill, unquote. Let me be clear. This is the first officially recorded and sanctioned ghost story in English history. It describes in stiff formal prose multiple sightings of quote specters in the shape of soldiers unquote by quote persons of quality and repute unquote. Here's an actual excerpt. Quote, these strange apparitions appeared in the same form and equipage as they had lived, fighting one another with as great a noise and clashing of swords as might be imagined, even to the terror and amazement of all that beheld them. Unquote. Now, King Charles the First, oh, he's going to laugh this off, right? No, he did not laugh it off. He didn't condemn it either. What did he do? He included it in the court ledger. For a war-torn king fighting not just parliament, but maybe a bit of his own conscience, this must have struck a nerve. Now, after the report, sightings continued. One local rector described the haunting as persistent, occurring most dreadfully near the turning of the seasons. Usually, it was always, almost all the time, late October. It was always near dusk, and always when the mist rolled in first from the east. Now, as the war raged on across York, Marston Moor, and eventually to Neza Bay, Edgehill became less a place of strategy and more a place of memory. It was a memory that England just simply couldn't bury. When Oliver Cromwell came to power and the monarchy fell, many such ghost stories were repressed. Puritans were not fond of spirits, living or otherwise. But yet, Edgehill persisted. In 1652, a wandering preacher named Elias Throckmorton claimed to have seen a figure, quote, in warlike form, bleeding from the mouth and staring at me from behind a hedge, unquote. He wrote it in his travel journey, buried in the archives of Cambridge. He described the figure as wearing, quote, a sash of crimson, badly faded, and no eyes where eyes should be, unquote. But yet, it watched him. Until it didn't. For the record, he never returned to Edgehill. So what were they? Was it residual energy, mass hallucinations, a psychic echo triggered by trauma, geography, and atmospheric conditions? Well, the answer really isn't simple, because these weren't singular, shocking events. They were rhythmic, predictable, as though the battle had been carved into the land itself, not just the people, not just the memory, but the soil. You could almost say Edgehill wasn't haunted by ghosts. Edgehill itself was the ghost. And perhaps, just perhaps, it still is.
Rising dust, the earth still shakes, ash and ember in my wake. Still remembers every song. ghost in iron trained and sold. But then I saw you fierce and small, and knew I'd rise if I would fall. You are the fire that forged the blade, the name behind the vow I made. Each breath I hold, you set it free. You are the why inside of me. You gave me hope when I was hollow. You turned my blade to something true. I faced the dark and death did follow, but every time I rode for you. No king, no creed, no holy vow could change the man I'm trying now. A son, a name, a second breath, a vow to ride through flame or death. You gave me hope when I was hollow. You made me see a world worth pain. I lived through fire, rage, and sorrow, but I returned and spoke your name.
And welcome back. It's great to be back. Just programming update. Tonight was supposed to be a Lost Wanderer, but because of events in my personal life, the last 2 weeks have not been kind. So you're getting a makeup ITC episode 65 that should have aired last Sunday. And next week, ITC will be back again in this time spot for episode 66 for a really, really unfortunately, perhaps timed episode. More on that later. So here we are after the break. Time is rolling forward. As is the way kings are replaced. Parliaments, well, they rise and they fall. Redcoats will give way to khaki, sabers to rifles, and England begins to forget the chaos of 1642. But not everyone forgets Edgehill, because let's face it, Edgehill, well, it won't let you. As the 18th century dawns, the battlefield fades into the hedgerows of history. But locals are still speaking in hush, lowered tones. And the stories, they grow stranger, not less, not even fainter, stranger. In 1706, references to Edgehill spectral reenactments had returned in newly printed chapbooks. Those cheap, thin little pamphlets filled with ghost tales, miracle cures, and scandalous poetry. One particular pamphlet, titled The March of Dead Men, was sold in Oxfordshire inns and included an account of a traveler who, quote, was set upon by drumming specters and chased a full mile, unquote. Now, that's probably a bit of an embellishment, for storytelling flair, but what stands out is the tone. These are not moralistic tales, not even cautionary ones. They aren't even trying to scare sinners straight. They're more or less just reports, quiet, grim, and treated with a sense of local truth. A few decades later, in 1752, Reverend Elisha Warford, or Elisha, one of the two, of Warwick, writes in his parish notes that, quote, "Twice I have witnessed men bearing arms cross the old field in silence. Their dress is of a former time. I could hear their boots upon the earth, but no voices would escape their lips," unquote. And that line, I think, really needs to be reemphasized here. Boots upon the earth, but no voices. As though even the dead knew they weren't allowed to speak anymore. Now, throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, Edgehill developed a particularly strange pattern. Sightings involving horses. Over and over again, witnesses report the sound of galloping hooves, thunderous like a charge, rushing past in full formation, only to vanish. One coachman passing near Kenton in 1794 is quoted in a local newspaper saying he was, quote, nearly overthrown by a cavalry he could not see, unquote. He said the noises were deafening. Iron shod hooves, men barking commands, the scream of horses in terror. But when he stopped his carriage, nothing. No dust, no prints, just sheer silence. But what is important here is his own passengers were pale and trembling. Now, this isn't a single tall tale, it's part of a pattern. Not ghosts simply standing around saying, "Hey, how you doing?" Not blurry figures in doorways, but something bigger. A scene that just simply seems to play itself out again and again and once more with feeling. Now, in the 1800s, the romanticism is in full swing, and England's love affair with the ghost story is entering its golden age. The Edgehill hauntings got picked up by a new kind of chronicler, the gentleman antiquarian. These were well to do hobby historians, men with powdered wigs, pipe tobacco, and, let's face it, too much time on their hands. But they did document ruins and folklore in lavish journals. Now, one such man, Sir Nicholas Thornton, visited Edgehill in 1821 and claimed to have seen, quote, a regiment of infantry, arms to shoulders, ghostly white, proceeding in absolute lockstep across the lower moor, unquote. Now, Thornton, despite writing like a man trying to win a duel with someone with his vocabulary, he was considered a serious amateur historian. He didn't believe in witches. He thought astrology was bunk. But he did believe in Edgehill. And he claimed the ghosts weren't random. They didn't just simply wander around. They weren't some sort of confused spirits. They were very organized. They followed orders. They were very, very, very disciplined. And that unsettled him far more than the idea of just random wandering souls. Because discipline requires a cause. Might even say it requires a will and it requires a purpose. And who, he asked, was giving the orders? Now, by the Victorian era, England was straddling two worlds, the world of steam and science, and the world of seances and spirit boards. And of course, Edgehill was now caught in that crossfire. In 1864, a new railway was proposed that would run right through part of the Edgehill Ridge. Local protesters, both from historical societies and, well, let's face it, ghost lovers, argued that the land was, quote, scarred and sacred by war and haunted by fate, unquote. A bizarre compromise was reached. The line was rerouted to run just south of the most infamous area, but not before the railway surveyor, a name that has sadly been lost to time, filed a report saying his team, quote, encountered unnatural resistance when attempting to break ground near the old burial hill, unquote. He would later write about the soil, quote, "It moaned like a man wounded," unquote. Now, we love to speak truths and facts here. It was probably metaphor, but I'm going to stress the word here, probably. But it's the kind of metaphor you don't make lightly in a railway report. And more importantly, the locals, they believed him. They said the land did not want to be disturbed because it was still occupied. Now, in 1915, during World War I, a group of soldiers training in the Warwickshire area reported, quote, "a phantom unit," unquote, near Edgehill. According to Captain Jonathan Drayton, his unit saw, quote, "a line of marching soldiers crossing the ridge at twilight," unquote, wearing what appeared to be outdated gear, breastplates, leather boots, and iron helmets. They just simply assumed it was some sort of reenactment they had no clue about. Or maybe just home guard exercises or something fun. But when they asked command the next day, no such unit had been dispatched. No reenactments were even scheduled, and the area was under restricted training protocol. The men that talked about it were ridiculed, but they swore what they saw was real. It was not ghost, it was not wisp, it was a functioning, operating platoon, moving with precision and gear gleaming like it had just come off the line. Drayton never forgot it. Now, unfortunately, he was killed 2 years later in Ypres, but his journal survived. And the entry simply ends with, quote, "I saw the dead. They were on time and they had to be, and they had somewhere to be," unquote. Now, the 20th century brought cameras, newsreels, documentaries, and Edgehill did not disappoint. In 1974, an ITV special titled "Haunted Britain" featured Edgehill prominently. A cameraman claimed to see men in shadow moving in the distance while filming B-roll, only to find no trace in the footage. But he said he remembered the exact moment because the air went suddenly cold, like he stepped into a walk-in freezer. In 1992, a BBC radio team covering haunted locations broadcast live from Edgehill on Halloween. During the show, a sound technician recorded what he claimed was drumming, faint but rhythmic, playing under their own voices during playback. It was dismissed as ambient interference. That is, until it happened again. This time under completely different atmospheric conditions, different time of day, different mic, and different engineer. The beat was the same. Just a slow rat-a-tat, 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 like a distant snare tuning up for something. Now, you would think in the age that we currently are in of smartphones and satellite imaging, the hauntings would stop, right? Or maybe at least become very easy to disprove. But Edgehill, oh, Edgehill, it just doesn't care about any of this modern bullcrap. In 2009, two hikers near Ratley claimed they saw, quote, "three men in old war dress standing motionless at the base of the trees," unquote. They took photos, blurry, distorted, and indistinct. And both their phones crashed minutes later. The images were unrecoverable. More recently, in 2021, a paranormal investigator named Sarah Lockhart posted a night vision video from Edgehill in which a figure seems to walk from right to left through the mist, disappearing behind some trees. She thought it was a prank until she checked the thermal footage. There was no heat signature. And the figure, roughly 6 feet tall, moved without displacing any air, according to her LiDAR scans. Now, let's just pause for a moment here. Not for any dramatic effect. I think this show's been quite dramatic, if I do say so myself. But maybe let's just catch our breath. Because here is where it gets uncomfortable. We have centuries of documented sightings from parish records, royal scribes, and modern investigators describing the exact same thing. Troops marching, ghostly reenactments, timed appearances, cold zones, and unnatural sound phenomena. What are we looking at here? A time loop, residual psychic energy, a battlefield so soaked in trauma that reality itself has given way. Or maybe it's a story so powerful, so repeated, so believed that it burned itself into the earth. It might be a cultural echo chamber, a myth so sustained, so retold, that the human brain keeps remapping it into reality. But if that's true, why do the sightings all occur in the same place at the same times and match across the centuries? Let's face it, that's not any kind of hysteria. That's a pattern. And patterns mean something is still moving out there, even now. Now, let's face it, the story of Edgehill is not a neat one. There's not a single ghost, no tidy seance can summon it. There's no final exorcism, no priest crossing himself and walking away as the credits roll. Instead, we just have simply echoes, and echoes that won't fade. They're bouncing, they're bending, and sometimes, if the shape of the place is just right, they persist. What makes the haunting of Edgehill so different, so defiant, is that it has never stopped. It didn't peak in the superstitious 1600s. It didn't fade in the Enlightenment age. It didn't even flinch in the face of electricity, steam engines, or microchips. Edgehill is just simply remembering. And the land itself has deemed that it was worthy to play back over and over and over again. And one of the strangest things about the Edgehill phenomenon isn't just that people keep reporting it, it's when they report it. Time after time, sightings they spike in late October, usually within a week of the original battle fought on October 23rd, 1642. Not just in the 17th century, not just in folklore, but in modern police logs, university archives, and private journals. In 1983, a team from Oxford Paranormal Research conducted field recordings at Edgehill for 6 straight nights between October 20th and 26th. These instruments picked up sub-bass frequency pulsing at 1.2 hertz on 3 of those nights, each between 7:15 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. Now that's inaudible to the human ear, and it causes anxiety, chills, and nausea in mammals. Now, these are the same symptoms that have been reported by multiple witnesses for over 300 years. Infrasound, like what tigers use to paralyze prey, or what nature uses to announce a coming storm. But in this case, it doesn't come from the wind, it came from the ground beneath the field. Now, in 1996, a Freedom of Information request was filed with the UK Ministry of Defense regarding, quote, anomalous military sightings in Warwickshire, unquote. The MOD returned a brief clipped reply, quote, no such incidents recorded by official personnel. Edgehill is not considered a location of military interest, unquote. But in 2003, during the partial declassification of Cold War archives, an internal 1968 document surfaced in a redacted MOD planning memo. Among the topics, quote, recurrence of historic battlefield phenomenon, colon, Edgehill, unquote. It was buried kind of in a footnote with no context, no author, just a name. But it was there. Now, what would the Ministry of Defense want with a battlefield that hasn't hosted a military engagement in over 380 years? Or maybe the better question to ask is, what made them think it still did? Now, let me take you to a slightly more modern case. In October 2008, a retired police officer named Alan Wright was walking his dog along the ridge near Edgehill. He lived in the area his whole life, never believed in the stories. He just considered them drunken pub talk. But that night, he swore he saw something, a line of figures, 7 or 8 at least, moving across the field in full kit. Not modern fatigues, but buff leather, bandoliers, helmets like inverted bowls. What did he do? Well, he stopped and then he watched. They didn't speak. They didn't even acknowledge him. They moved like a drill team, hands snapping to invisible commands. Now, Wright would eventually call out. There was no response. Then, just as the last figure reached the edge of the ridge, they turned their head, and he saw nothing. No face, just a flat black void beneath the helmet. Now, Wright, by his own account, didn't run. He just simply walked slowly, deliberately, until he reached his car and drove home with the dog still shivering in the back seat. He told the story to his daughter and his daughter alone. That is until 2021, when he agreed to share it on record for a BBC Radio 4 interview. When asked what he thought he saw, his reply was simple, quote, "I think the field doesn't know it's done. I think it keeps the men it needs," unquote. Now let's step back a little here, because maybe you're wondering how can any of this be real? I mean, we come on, we live in the age of quantum computing, Mars rovers, and CRISPR gene editing. Are we still really talking about ghosts? Uh, Maybe not as much in the traditional sense here. What Edgehill gives us isn't just a haunting. It is like a trauma loop. The field has a version of PTSD that it just relives and relives and relives. And it's, you look at a trauma loop. The human brain processes extreme violence through a surge of neurochemical activity, epinephrine, cortisol, and adrenaline. When this happens in mass in the same physical space, like on a battlefield, it creates kind of a shared trauma field. Now take that and multiply it by thousands, men screaming, men dying, hating, and then praying. Layer after layer after layer of emotional devastation, all focused on a single patch of earth. This is less a ghost story and more a telling of a scar, a geological memory, a trauma that has been burned into the land itself. And like all scars, sometimes it aches. Now, Edgehill isn't alone. There are dozens of battlefields around the world with similar stories. Gettysburg, my favorite place in Pennsylvania, where tourists and rangers report hearing Civil War bugles from empty fields. And by God, do not go to Sniper Hill on the night of on the night of one or of the battles, because you have places in Turkey where Turkish soldiers have seen phantom Anzacs. Verdun in France, where fog gathers unnaturally fast and certain bunkers remain cold year round. But Edgehill remains unique for one reason. It's the first officially recorded military haunting in English history, and unlike the others, it isn't reactive, it's repetitive. It doesn't lash out, it replays, like a record with a scratch. And that kind of raises one final question. What is it trying to tell us? Well, Edgehill doesn't just spook, it instructs. And maybe that's the whole point, because every time a ghost replays itself, it's telling a story it was never allowed to finish. Every time we glimpse it, we're being reminded. We're reminded of the cost we bury. We're reminded of the wars we whitewash, of the pain we refuse to name. And maybe Edgehill isn't cursed. Maybe it's just simply honest. Because the truth is, England's Civil War never really ended. The monarch returned, the parliament survived, but the division, the fear, the willingness to bleed your neighbor to defend an idea, that's still here. Edgehill isn't the ghost. We are. We carry the grudge. We remember the flags, the banners, the divine rights. And so the field remembers us. Not out of vengeance, not out of hate, but because we were never told we were done. Now, if you visit Edgehill today, you'll find a mostly peaceful rise, trees, grass. There are a few plaques, a commemorative stone, and very little noise. But wait until the light dies. Wait until the fog rolls in. Wait until your ears begin to deceive you and ask yourself, was that the wind? Where's it the boots on the ridge? And if you see a line of soldiers walking from east to west, blades drawn, heads bowed, don't call out, don't follow, don't interrupt, because this battle was never about us. We've just inherited the noise. So you've just heard the story of Phantom Battle of Edgehill, a fight that started on a cold October afternoon and somehow, some way, never quite ended. Maybe it's ghost, maybe it's history carved into the bone of the earth, or maybe it's just the sound of a country trying to remember what it's trying to forget. The dead don't always stay down, and some battlefields don't really care who wins. They just want the fight. I am JEFF. This has been In the Crease, the show that drags history out of the ground and dares to ask what really happened. If you enjoy the show, follow us on klrnradio.com and on KLRN Radio at X or wherever you tune into podcast. And remember, if you hear drums in the distance tonight, don't worry, unless they start to get closer. And next time on ITC, we're going to go somewhere I never thought would be timely. We're going to explore near-death experiences and the afterlife. Until then, stay strange, stay curious, and remember, the past, it isn't dead. It's just waiting for orders. And scary thought is we might still be on that battlefield. Good night.